On a cold morning in November of 1913, a man walked into the town of Comfort, Texas, wearing clothes that had gone out of fashion 3 decades earlier. He asked for directions to a farmhouse that no longer existed. When the sheriff was called and asked the stranger his name, the man answered without hesitation, a name the town had buried, quite literally, in memory, if not in body, 30 years before. He was the same age he had been the day he disappeared. He said he had only been gone a few hours. He said he had simply gone for a walk in the woods. No one who saw his face that day ever fully explained what they were looking at, and to this day, no one has. In the autumn of 1883, the Texas Hill Country was still, in every sense that mattered, a frontier. The Comanche raids that had terrorized the region for 2 generations had only recently ceased in any meaningful way, and the German and Anglo settlers who had carved farms out of the limestone hills around Comfort still kept rifles within reach of every door. It was a hard country, beautiful in the way that hard country often is. Live oaks bent by wind, cedar brakes thick enough to swallow a man whole, and creeks that ran clear over white rock before vanishing underground for miles at a stretch. Elias Cobb had built his farm on the eastern edge of that country 9 years earlier, on 80 acres of land bought cheap because everyone said it couldn't be worked. He proved them wrong. By 1883, he had a wife, Sarah, 29 years old, and already carrying the weight of frontier life in the lines around her eyes, 2 young children, and a herd of cattle that had grown slowly but steadily into something like prosperity. Neighbors described him as a quiet man, unremarkable in most ways, the kind of man who said little at church socials and worked from before dawn until after dark. He did not drink. He did not gamble. He had no known enemies, no debts of any consequence, and no history of wandering. On the morning of October the 14th, a Sunday, Elias told his wife he intended to walk the ridge above the creek before the midday meal, a stretch of wooded high ground he crossed perhaps once a week, checking a fence line and a spring that watered part of his herd. It was not a long walk. He had made it, by Sarah's later account, dozens of times before, and always returned within 2 hours. He left the house a little after 9 in the morning, carrying no provisions, no weapon beyond the small knife he kept on his belt, and no coat, though the day was cool. He did not come back for dinner. He did not come back by dark. Sarah's account of that evening, given later to searchers and recorded in the notes of the county's part-time deputy, described a woman who tried for the first several hours not to panic. Farmers were sometimes delayed. A fence needed mending, a calf had wandered, the light had failed before the walk home. But Elias Cobb was a methodical man, and methodical men did not simply fail to appear. By midnight, Sarah had walked to the nearest neighboring farm, nearly 2 miles distant, and roused the family to raise an alarm. What followed, over the next several days, was one of the larger search efforts the county had mounted in years. Neighbors, several dozen strong at the search's peak, walked the ridge and the creek bottom in long grid lines. They dragged the deeper pools of the creek where it widened before disappearing into its underground channel. They checked the cedar brakes thick enough to hide a man's body from a search party walking 20 feet away. They found his fence line undisturbed. They found no blood, no torn clothing, no sign of a struggle, no tracks leading away from the ridge in any direction that made sense. They found, in the words of one searcher whose account survives in a county history compiled decades later, nothing at all, as though the man had simply stepped sideways out of the world. There was, in fairness, no shortage of theories, and the theories say a great deal about what an 1883 Texas community considered plausible danger. Some believed Elias had been killed by a lingering Comanche raiding party, though the timing made this increasingly unlikely to most who knew the recent history of the region. Some believed he had fallen into one of the region's many limestone sinkholes or into the underground channel of the creek itself, his body carried into some cave system beneath the hills that riddled that part of the hill country and were, even then, only partially mapped. A smaller number, never spoken aloud in Sarah's presence, wondered whether a respectable, quiet, debt-free farmer had simply decided, on a Sunday morning, to walk away from his life entirely. Though no one who knew him found this easy to believe, and no trace of him was ever found in any direction, in any town, in any record that would support it. By the second week, the search had shrunk to a handful of the most determined neighbors. By the end of the month, it had ended altogether. Sarah Cobb was left with 2 children, 80 acres of land she could not work alone, and a husband who was, in every practical sense that mattered to a frontier widow, gone. Though the law, in the absence of a body, was in no hurry to declare him dead. The county recorded the matter in the sparse language such records used as a disappearance, cause unknown, presumed accidental. The file was thin. It remains thin, and for 30 years, it remained closed. Grief on the frontier was rarely permitted the luxury of lingering. Sarah Cobb mourned her husband in the manner available to her, which was to say briefly, and then to survive. Within 18 months of Elias's disappearance, with the county court having made no formal determination and likely to make none for years, Sarah petitioned to have her husband declared legally dead, a process that in 1880s Texas required a waiting period and a hearing, and was not always granted easily in cases without a body. It was granted in her case in the spring of 1886, nearly 3 years after Elias vanished, on the strength of the search records and the sworn testimony of a dozen neighbors who had walked the ridge themselves. Sarah remarried in 1887 to a widower from a neighboring county named Henry Voss, a man 11 years her senior with 3 children of his own from his first marriage. The blended household settled onto Voss's land, some 15 miles from the Cobb farm, which was sold. The 80 acres Elias had proven the doubters wrong about, sold for a fraction of what it might have brought had its ownership not been clouded by the strange manner of its owner's disappearance. The 2 Cobb children, a boy and a girl, grew up under Henry Voss's roof, and in time under his name in all but strict legal fact. The boy, Thomas, was 4 when his father vanished. He would later tell a newspaperman that he retained no clear memory of the man at all, only a general impression, secondhand, and inherited rather than remembered, assembled from what his mother had told him. The years that followed were, in the way of frontier decades, eventful in the aggregate and unremarkable in the particular. The railroad reached deeper into the hill country. Comfort grew from a scattering of farms into something resembling a proper town, with a bank, a newspaper, and a courthouse that no longer needed to double as a fort. Sarah Voss, as she was now known, raised 5 children between her 2 marriages worth of offspring, buried Henry Voss in 1908 after a long illness, and by 1913 was a woman of 59, a grandmother several times over, living a quiet widowhood on the Voss land with her youngest daughter's family. The disappearance of Elias Cobb had not been forgotten exactly. Frontier communities had long memories for their unsolved mysteries, and the story was told with steadily diminishing accuracy at gatherings for years afterward. But it had settled into the category of things that simply were, unanswered and unanswerable, filed alongside the other unresolved oddities every old settlement seems to accumulate. No one by 1913 expected an answer. No one was looking for one anymore, which is precisely what made the morning of November the 3rd, 1913, so difficult for everyone who witnessed it to process in real time. The man who walked into Comfort that morning was, by every account later given to the local newspaper, unremarkable in his bearing and deeply remarkable in every other respect. He wore a style of coat that had not been made in 20 years, and trousers of a cut the town's younger residents did not recognize at all. He asked of the first person he encountered on the main street, a boy of perhaps 14, running an errand for his father's store, for directions to the Cobb farm. The boy had never heard of the Cobb farm. He directed the stranger, sensibly enough, to the sheriff's office on the theory that a man asking after a property no one could place was, at minimum, lost, and at most, in need of the kind of attention a small-town sheriff was equipped to provide. The sheriff of Comfort in 1913, a man named Rudolph Ahrens, who had held the post for 11 years and had grown up in the county himself, later gave an account of the encounter that was reprinted with evident bewilderment in the local paper within the week. The stranger gave his name without hesitation and without any apparent awareness that it should mean anything unusual, as Elias Whitmore Cobb. He stated that he had left his farm that morning to walk the ridge above the creek, as was his habit, and that he could not account for how he had come to be standing on the main street of a town whose layout he did not recognize, though he recognized, he said, its name. He asked what year it was. When told, he did not immediately believe it, and when the sheriff pressed him to explain the discrepancy, 30 years unaccounted for by his own account experienced as a single morning's walk, the man's answer, recorded by Ahrens as closely to verbatim as he could manage, was this: that he had walked into the cedar brake above the creek, as he had 100 times before, and that at some point in that walk, without any sensation of time passing or of anything unusual occurring, he had found himself walking out of a wooded stretch he did not recognize into a town he did. He offered no further explanation, then or ever. He did not claim to have been held captive. He did not claim illness or memory loss in any conventional sense. He recalled the morning of his disappearance with total clarity, and recalled nothing whatsoever of the 30 years in between, not because the memory was damaged, he insisted, but because, so far as his own experience was concerned, no time had passed at all. What struck Sheriff Ahrens most, by his own account, was not the story. Frontier sheriffs had heard stranger claims from men in far worse condition, but the man himself. Elias Cobb, if this was in fact Elias Cobb, appeared to be a man in his late 30s. Neighbors who had known the original Elias Cobb, summoned to the sheriff's office over the following days to render an opinion, were unanimous and visibly shaken in their agreement. The man before them looked in face, build, bearing, and even the particular scar above his left eyebrow from a childhood accident with a plow blade, exactly, not approximately, but exactly, as Elias Cobb had looked the last time any of them had seen him, 3 decades earlier. News of the stranger's arrival reached Sarah Voss within hours, carried by a neighbor who arrived at her door in evident distress, uncertain how to describe what the town was saying without sounding as though she had lost her senses. Sarah's reaction, as later described by her daughter to the newspaperman who eventually wrote up the fullest account of the case, was not joy. It was something closer to dread. Sarah Voss did not go to town that first day, nor the second. Her daughter later said that her mother sat for the better part of 2 days in a kind of stunned stillness, unwilling either to dismiss the story outright or to accept what accepting it would mean. She had mourned Elias Cobb once, formally, legally, with a hearing and a ruling in a widow's black dress. She had built a second life on the settled fact of his death. A man walking into town claiming to be Elias, looking as Elias had looked, threatened not grief, but the entire architecture of the 30 years that had followed it. It was Thomas, her son, 28 years old in 1913, and running his stepfather's former land with a family of his own, who went to see the stranger first. Thomas had been 4 when his father disappeared and retained, by his own account, no independent memory of the man's face, only photographs of which there were few, and his mother's descriptions offered rarely and reluctantly over the years. What Thomas found in the sheriff's office, he later told the newspaperman, was a man who matched every photograph he had ever seen of his father with an exactness that felt less like recognition than confrontation. The stranger, for his part, looked at Thomas, a grown man, older by appearance than the father who stood before him, and by Thomas's account, could not immediately reconcile what he was seeing either. He is said to have asked quietly whether this was truly his son, and to have received no comfortable answer because Thomas himself was not certain what answer to give. The reunion with Sarah, when it finally occurred 4 days after the stranger's arrival, was by every surviving account brief, formal, and deeply strained. She confirmed, before witnesses that included the sheriff and the town's doctor, that the man's face, voice, and the specific manner of a particular habitual gesture, a way of rubbing his jaw when considering a question, were identical to her first husband's. She did not embrace him. She did not, in the presence of witnesses, express relief or joy. She is recorded as having asked him a single question, which the sheriff later repeated to the newspaperman with evident discomfort at its implications. She asked whether he understood that he had a wife, and that his wife was now another man's widow, and married to no one, and that she did not know what he expected of her. The town's reaction in the days that followed split roughly into 3 camps, and the fault lines mattered a great deal to what followed. A portion of Comfort's residents, largely the older generation who remembered the original search in 1883, were inclined to accept the man's identity on the strength of physical resemblance alone, however inexplicable the 30-year gap in his apparent age. A second, more skeptical portion, including notably several of the town's newer residents who had no memory of the original Elias Cobb at all, suspected an elaborate confidence scheme, aimed perhaps at the modest estate the Cobb name might still carry, or at some other advantage not yet apparent. And a third portion, smaller but vocal, found the entire situation sufficiently unsettling, a man who had not aged a day in 30 years, that they wanted nothing to do with the matter at all, and said so at church and at the general store, in tones that made clear they considered the stranger's presence in town to be, in some undefined but real sense, a danger. Sarah Voss, caught between a legal second marriage, a grown family that called another man father in all but blood, and a first husband who appeared before her exactly as he had on the morning he vanished, chose in the following weeks to keep the stranger at a careful distance, permitting occasional brief visits with Thomas and eventually with her daughter, but declining to resume any semblance of the life the two of them had once shared. It was, several who knew her later said, the only response available to a woman asked to reconcile 30 years of a settled life with a man who insisted, credibly and to his own apparent bewilderment, that no time had passed for him at all. The town's unease found in the weeks following the stranger's arrival a more formal outlet. At the urging of several residents, and by most accounts with the stranger's own full cooperation, Sheriff Ahrens arranged for the man to be examined by Comfort's physician, Dr. Ferdinand Klein, a German-trained doctor who had practiced in the hill country for over 2 decades and had, in fact, briefly treated the original Elias Cobb for a minor injury some years before the 1883 disappearance, a detail that would matter a great deal to what followed. Dr. Klein's examination, portions of which were later summarized in the newspaper account and referenced in a brief note in the county's sparse records, found a man in what he described as excellent physical condition for his apparent age of roughly 37 or 38 years, consistent notably with Elias Cobb's age at the time of his disappearance in 1883, and entirely inconsistent with the 67 years Elias Cobb would have accumulated had he simply aged normally in the intervening decades. Klein noted the scar above the left eyebrow, consistent with his own recollection of treating the young farmer years before. He found no evidence of the sort of physical deterioration, malnutrition, or exposure one might expect of a man claiming to have wandered 30 years in wilderness, nor any evidence of the kind of injury or captivity that might explain a prolonged absence through more mundane means. The man's teeth, his joints, his eyesight, his hearing, all, Klein noted with evident unease in his own written summary, were those of a man in his late 30s, not his late 60s. Asked directly by Klein to account for the physical impossibility of his own condition, The stranger offered no theory of his own beyond the one he had given from the start, that he had walked into the woods one morning and, by his own experience of time, walked out of them again within the same morning, encountering a town 30 years removed from the one he had left. He expressed, by Klein's account, genuine and apparently unfeigned distress at his own situation. The loss of 30 years he could not account for troubled him deeply, he said, more than any physical explanation of it. He asked several times, after details of the intervening decades, the fates of neighbors, the growth of the town, the deaths that had occurred in his absence, and reacted each time with what witnesses described as authentic grief upon learning of losses among people he had known. It was this apparent authenticity, more than any physical evidence, that persuaded a growing number of Comfort's residents that whatever had happened to Elias Cobb, the man now living quietly on the edge of town, Thomas had eventually arranged modest lodging for him, unwilling to leave his father, whoever or whatever he was, entirely without support, was not engaged in any deliberate deception. A confidence man, several noted, would have arrived with a story, a plan, some evident angle of advantage. This man arrived with nothing but bewilderment and a claim so physically impossible that it offered him no practical benefit at all and considerable social difficulty. No formal legal resolution to the matter was ever reached. The 1886 ruling declaring Elias Cobb legally dead was never overturned, there being, in the county court's apparent view, no established legal mechanism for reversing a death ruling on the basis of a man's unverifiable claim about his own experience of time, however much his physical appearance seemed to support it. Sarah Voss's second marriage, though Henry Voss had by then been 3 years in his grave, was never in practical terms unwound, nor was any attempt made to restore Elias's claim to land long since sold to other owners. The stranger, the town, tellingly, never fully settled on whether to call him Elias or something else, lived quietly at the edge of Comfort for a little over a year, seeing his children occasionally, speaking to almost no one else about what had happened to him, and offering, until the end of his time in the town's records, no further account of his missing 30 years than the one he had given the sheriff on his very first morning back. In the spring of 1915, a year and a half after his return, the man who called himself Elias Cobb left Comfort. He told Thomas, by the son's later account, that he intended to walk the ridge above the creek one final time, the same stretch of wooded high ground he had crossed on the morning of his original disappearance in 1883. Before deciding what remained of his life he wished to build elsewhere. Thomas offered to accompany him. The man declined gently, saying only that it was a walk he needed to take alone. He was never seen again. No search was mounted this time with anything like the scale of 1883's effort. The county by 1915 had grown accustomed enough to the case's strangeness that a second disappearance, however unsettling, drew more resignation than alarm. Thomas and a handful of neighbors walked the ridge and the creek bottom over the following days, finding, as searchers had found 32 years earlier, nothing at all. No tracks leading away in any direction, no sign of struggle or accident, no trace of the coat he had been wearing, no trace of the man himself. The cedar brake, thick and largely unchanged since 1883, kept whatever answer it held. The case of Elias Whitmore Cobb was never solved, in any sense that satisfies the ordinary requirements of the word. No official theory was ever formally adopted by the county, no later investigation, and there were a handful over the following decades, conducted largely by curious journalists and amateur historians rather than any official body, produced physical evidence bearing on the 30-year gap, on the man's unaged appearance, or on his second and final disappearance in 1915. Dr. Klein's written notes on his 1913 examination survived, incomplete, in a private collection for decades before being cited in a regional history of the Hill Country published in the 1960s, by which point every direct witness to the events of 1913 was dead, and the case had passed fully from living memory into local legend, repeated at gatherings, altered with each retelling, and steadily harder to separate from the embellishments 5 decades of storytelling had layered onto it. What can be said with confidence is limited and stark in its limitation. A farmer disappeared from a wooded ridge in the Texas Hill Country in 1883, and an extensive search found no trace of him. 30 years later, a man matching his exact appearance, unaged, in possession of details and mannerisms that convinced those who had known the original Elias Cobb of his authenticity, walked out of a town whose current layout he did not recognize, claiming to have experienced the intervening decades as a single morning's walk. He lived quietly and troubled among people who could not fully accept or fully reject his account for a little over a year, and then he walked back into the same stretch of woods that had first taken him and did not return a second time. The ridge above the creek still stands today, largely unchanged by the standards of the surrounding development, a stretch of cedar and live oak on private land outside the modern town of Comfort. No official marker records what is said to have happened there. The county's records on the Cobb case remain, by any researcher's account who has gone looking for them, remarkably thin for a story so widely repeated. A single search log from 1883, a handful of newspaper clippings from 1913, and Dr. Klein's incomplete examination notes, and very little else. What happened to Elias Cobb in the 30 years between his disappearance and his return has never been explained by any theory that satisfies the physical facts as they were recorded by the people who witnessed them. And what happened to him after he walked back into those same woods in 1915 has never been explained at all.